Before I begin, I would like to thank the Center of Excellence in Gender Studies for having us here. And as you might have figured out from the introduction, I'm not part of academia. My last paid job was that of a radio host. So I would like to first appreciate and acknowledge the knowledge that has been produced outside the academia, which is basically where most of my paper is derived from. The knowledge that is created on the streets by my trans sisters and the knowledge that is created outside because of the structural exclusions of education. I think that's really where most of my knowledge really comes from. And I think the last time I did anything even vaguely academic would be sitting in Professor Nivedita's class, I think around 6 years back. So my paper really looks at the exclusions that trans people have faced in dominant caste mainstream feminist movements, and also it historically tries to trace the terminology that has been used for trans communities in India. And I would also like to say that before I identify myself as an anti-caste trans feminist now, before that I was a militant lesbian feminist. And so my own personal journey through naming and renaming myself has also informed a lot of this paper. So I'm going to skip through the first parts of the paper because the paper is kind of long, and I would just like to summarize the first parts of my paper, which really looks at the writings of dominant caste women in the 19th century, notably Tarabai Shinde and Pandita Ramabai, who have written books in the 19th century, and we see that caste as a marker was very much inscribed into their narrative in the 19th century. Right, and Professor Nivedita has also talked about the challenge to dominant caste feminism that emerged in the 1990s from Dalit feminists. And if you look at the writings of dominant caste women in the 19th century, you see that caste was inscribed in their narrative. So what informed and enabled this erasure of caste after the 19th century, and some of the historical reasons that I was able to trace for that, was the fact that the Indian nationalist movement created this idea of the universal Indian citizen, who was unmarked by these various identities of caste, religion, and community. And of course, the unmarked universal was always the cisgender, Hindu, dominant caste man. And in opposition to this, the various other identities were constructed. And also the reformist movements that emerged in the 19th and the 20th century, specifically after the East India Company took administrative control over India, the patronage of courtesans descended. And that was really where the education for women was concentrated. And because of this decline in patronage, education among women was considered to be associated with bad morality. And this is something that Susi Taru and Lalita also talk about in their work. So after this, the reformist movements that came about, even within the anti-caste movements, there were some movements around education, like Jyotirao Phule and Savitribai Phule. Apart from this, the Raja Ramohan Roy, the dominant caste reformist movements, also addressed the issue of women's education. But the women who accessed this education through these reformist movements were mostly dominant caste women, who then became knowledge producers within the academia and outside. So both of these historical processes have informed and enabled this erasure of caste from dominant caste feminism. And after the challenges that were posed to it in the 1990s by Dalit feminists, of course there's a lot of scholarship now that does address the interlinkages between gender and caste. But my paper looks at predominantly this idea of gender as a given, as a biological construct. And as Nivedita said in her keynote lecture, the politics of caste and sexuality have posed a serious challenge to the biologically essentialist concept of women. And my paper looks at how the figure of the hijra has been written about in colonial history as well as by the Indian nation state post-independence. And to do this, we would have to look at the colonial records, particularly the census and also the travel records of Europeans who came to India during the colonial period. I would also like to inscribe myself into this narrative because I think most academic scholars do not write themselves into academic writing. And this gives the illusion of the social sciences being unmediated by the self and speaking objective truths, simultaneously placing autobiographical or first-person accounts at a subordinate level in the hierarchy of what is considered valuable academic writings. So it is important to break this hierarchy of imperialist knowledge production rooted in structural exclusions of caste, race, and gender. Feminist epistemology, especially of the third world women, who are black, Hispanic, Dalit, Chicana, and queer, reconceptualize and rewrite the self into their writings. The act of insertion of the self in these feminist epistemologies is an act of defiance to mark their difference and particularities against the erasure or silencing of their voices by the hegemonic ways in which feminism was understood, conceptualized, and reproduced. So I would like to at this point make legible my positions as a man of transgender experience who was raised by a dominant caste mother, who's been university educated and who's also queer identified, and who was born and raised in the southern part of the subcontinent. So if you look at the terminology that has come to be used for transactivism, as globally transactivism and transgender studies make big strides, it is important to be cognizant of, as Susan Stryker points out, the dissemination of transgender as a term that originated among white people within Eurocentric modernity, and it necessarily involves an engagement with the political conditions within and through which that term circulates. Because transgender can be imagined to include all possible variations from an often unstated norm. It risks becoming yet another project of colonization, a kind of Cartesian grid imposed on the globe for making sense of human diversity by measuring it within a Eurocentric frame of reference against a Eurocentric standard. This colonizing modernity is globalized through strategies, of course, as you all know, the recent multiple gender options given by capitalist giants like Facebook, and also through strategies of pinkwashing which the Israeli government uses to kind of erase the settler colonialism of Palestine, or the violent settler colonialism of Palestine, by appearing to be progressive on LGBTI issues. So the pinkwashing is a term that is used to refer to that. So this interplay of governmentality, biopolitical techniques of psychiatric medical practices, gender-affirming surgeries, and the NGO industrial complex dependent on HIV funding from the West, inform the linguistic and political production, control, disciplining, and reproduction of the transgender subject in the current context of India. Is being transgender a way of doing gender, or a way of undoing gender, or a way of being gendered, or all of these and none of these at the same time? Are we trans people merely subjects born out of the productive forces of power, the machinations of the power of the nation state with its promise of inclusive citizenship rights, capitalist pharmaceutical companies and the possibilities of gender affirmation procedures that they offer, and the NGO academic state-imposed categories of cultural legibility? Or do we, even as we are caught in this nexus, offer possibilities of the disruption of the very forces that attempt to produce and control us? How do we understand the experiences of trans people without negating our rights to bodily autonomy and integrity? This very institutionalized incitement to discourse, to use a Foucauldian term that is offered by this gender conference, is itself a productive effect of power. And I will not claim that using the word lesbian or transgender or homosexuality has any radical potential within this context. A historical inquiry into the attempts at codification of the gender binary system in the subcontinent can be undertaken through the acts, the census reports, and the historical records and ethnographies, and legal accounts of the colonial powers from the early 20th century and through the policies of the post-independent nation state. Such an inquiry will offer insight into the production and disruptions of the symbolic order of the gender binary system, a classificatory system that was imposed as a project of modernity by British colonialism. The Belgian artist Balthazar Solvens in La Hindus in 1810 provides a description of the hijras, and I quote, "It is doing justice to this vile class of beings to place them as I do here among the commonest women, whose dress even they affect to adopt. Nothing, I think, can inspire a stronger aversion for idolatry in its moral effects than the picture of the wretches who I am about to describe. Could it be believed that there is a country in the world which tolerates a set of men whose life is an outrage to morality and common decency by the ostentatious display with which they continually make the privation of the marks of their sex? This is the case in Hindustan. Some Hindus believe that they are really born in this state, but it is very certain that it is inflicted on themselves as a means of subsistence for them and their children, and for those hijras infest as vagabonds in the streets and bazaars, soliciting the charity of the passengers, and when they meet a European, they never fail to discover this claim to his commiseration." So you see here we have a description of the hijra as immoral, as mutilated men who inflict the state on themselves, an outrage to common decency, a figure of depravity sold into beggary and prostitution, and who's also of a vindictive disposition. Because the description goes on to say that if they do not get money from the household where a male child has been born, they would then climb to the roof and make water upon it as a curse and then it goes on to describe hijras as of a vindictive disposition. The French missionary Dubois, in his book in 1806, which was published in 1850, The Hindu Manners, Customs and Ceremonies, says, and I quote, "The facility with which the Hindu can gratify his passions in a natural manner in a country where courtesans abound renders these disgusting practices less common, but it by no means prevents them altogether. In the larger towns of India, there are generally houses to be found given over to this odious form of vice. One sometimes meets in the streets the degraded beings who adopt this infamous profession. They dress like women, let their hair grow in the same way, pluck out the hair on their faces, and copy the walk, gestures, manner of speaking, tone of voice, demeanor, and affectation of prostitutes. Other secret crimes are also carried on in India, and it goes on and on like that, until it reaches a description where it says, these are the very same sins mentioned in the Bible, which brought such terrible punishments on the inhabitants of Canaan. So you see here, this description places the figure of the Hijra as one that is overdetermined by gender expression, as imitative of femininity, engaged in the vices for the sexual gratification of Hindus through the practices of sodomy and degraded in status. However, here we see a direct reference to how the ways of the degenerate ways of the natives were an affront to the notions of Christian morality, a theme that is repeated in many European ethnographic studies to justify the penal provisions that would then later be used to civilize us. Some writings focus on the eunuchs of the Zenanas who enjoyed patronage under Muslims, while others refer to them as the practices among the Hindus. For instance, in an essay on the customs of Gosains, published as an appendix to Arthur Steele's Summary of the Law Custom of Hindu Caste, John Walden says, and I quote, "It may be observed that the lustrous Nashre, best known by the designation of hermaphrodite, wears the female sari and the male umbrella. These persons, whether born of the highest or the lowest caste, are outcast from their birth and considered the vilest and most polluted of beings. They live upon the alms which they exact from the Brahmin, at whose door they press their request, and who is willing to purchase their absence at any price. The condition is supposed to be induced by the debauchery committed by them on earth before the transmigration of their soul." So here in this description, we see the concept of pollution and karma, not as one that is, as seen in the earlier description, something that they asked for, but as a result of their sins in their previous life, this is something that is exacted upon them. And the concept of pollution and karma, as all of you know, is rooted very much in caste patriarchy. And this also shows that across caste, they were considered to be outcasts. Right? It says from the highest to the lowest caste, they were considered to be outcasts. In a translation of the Manusmriti, it's not just the European colonial records that show this kind of description. In a translation of the Manusmriti, Wendy Doniger and Smith also refer to the Kleba designated as a non-man, that is a sexually dysfunctional male who might be, according to the context, impotent, homosexual, a transvestite, or in some cases, a man with mutilated or defective sexual organs. So if you look at the census records of the colonial history, you will see that in 1830s, there was a census in Benares that was done by James Prinsep, and he mentions the Hijra and pegs their number at 50. And in 1881, there was an imperial census which classified the Hijras in Berar under the title Hijra and included them under the category of mendicant and vagrant caste. Whereas in Bombay, they were listed as a caste of dancers and musical instrument players. In the central provinces, the Hijras were included under the caste category of singers and dancers at birth and marriage feasts and beggars. In the census of 1871 and 1881, circulars were sent out to count Hijras as male. So you see from these accounts, we see the British classificatory regimes and the European ethnographic accounts struggle to ratify gender variance found among the colonial subjects as a separate class or caste of persons with distinct physical characteristics accorded a lower status in society, marked out by their immorality and sexual depravity, evaluated against the standard of a superior Christian morality. These studies discursively created the immoral other, who required to be civilized through penal provisions like the Hyderabad Eunuch Act of 1871, which criminalizes trans women to this present day. However, even before British colonialism, like I mentioned, Brahmanical texts like the Vishnu Purana, the Garuda Purana, the Manusmriti also describe the Hijra characterized by her overdetermined gender or sexual characteristics and uncontrolled or uncontrollable sexuality. Present-day articulations around trans identities largely rely on two models. One is the universal category from West brought to India through globalized activism and NGOs, to identify gender variants, and which is basically the transgender model. And the second being the indigenous third gender model, which find mention in the Hindu myths and legends and also rooted in the Islamic culture of the Zananas. Post the 1990s, the intervention of NGOs in local communities added one more characteristic to the existing ones, that of a high-risk group which must meet the targets of HIV funding related work. The indigenous third gender model is found in two streams. One of the Gharana Hijras who trace their lineage back to the Muslim Zananas and are characterized by asexuality and religiosity, and the other of the Hinduized Arvanis, Hijras and Mangalamukhis who trace their lineage back from the myths in the Mahabharata and enact the widowhood even today at the Kuvalam festival in Tamil Nadu. There are also practices which must be mentioned which exist in North Karnataka, South Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, which are really rooted in the ritualized caste slavery of the Devdasi tradition, where young children who are born to lower caste families are dedicated to goddess Yellamma, and then they express a feminine gender. So, if you look at all of these, you see that the diverse self-articulated identities of trans communities challenge and confound these imposed conceptual models. The common theme of British colonialism, caste colonization, the governmentality of the post-independent nation state, and the neo-colonial funding practices of the NGOs created a reified category of the Hijra as distinct from the rest of the population. All these colonial forces create and perpetuate themselves by othering, exoticizing, and victimizing the figure of the Hijra. Most academic writings on the subject are also informed by this colonial imagination, as we can see from what is considered a foundational text in trans studies, Serena Manga's Neither Man Nor Woman, written in 1990. From British colonial empire to the Brahmin empire that functions through the Indian nation state in the present context, the attempts at defining, disciplining, and containing the Hijra into a classificatory regime continue. In 2005, the central government introduced an E category in the passport application forms, E standing for eunuch. There were protests subsequent to this, after which the government repealed the passport application forms with the E on it. In April 2011, the government of Karnataka inserted Section 36A into the Karnataka Police Act, by which the police commissioner or the local police stations can have a register to keep the personal details of any Hijra living in the area who is just suspected of kidnapping or committing some unnatural offences. So these are the kind of criminalizing provisions that are being used till this present day. In 2011 census of the Indian nation state, the other category was introduced by the state for the enumeration of Hijras. But if you look at the manual which is given to the people who conduct the census, you would see, and I quote, eunuchs and hermaphrodites will be counted as males. Recently, in 2014, there were around 53 trans women who were picked up from the streets just for occupying public space and forcefully rehabilitated to an infamous rehabilitation site called the Beggars Colony in Bangalore. And the most common criminal provisions that are invoked against the trans community in India are basically the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act, public indecency and nuisance, grievous hurt, etc. This illustrates how the figure of the Hijra continues to be associated in the classificatory regimes of the post-independent nation state with the ideas of pollution, indecency, immorality, concepts rooted in the caste patriarchy in the Indian context. Now, if you look at the Supreme Court judgment, I'm sure all of you have heard about the Supreme Court judgment because there was a lot of celebration around it. But if you look at the ways in which the trans people have been described in the Supreme Court judgment, you will see the same confusing narratives of the judiciary. And I quote from the Supreme Court judgment, it says, Hijras are not men by virtue of anatomy, appearance and psychologically. They are also not women, though they are like women with no female reproduction organ and no menstruation. Since Hijras do not have reproduction capacities as either men or women, they are neither men nor women and claim to be an institutional third gender. Among Hijras, there are emasculated men and intersex persons and non-emasculated men. The trans people also includes persons who intend to undergo sex reassignment surgery, who have undergone sex reassignment surgery, or who cannot afford to undergo sex reassignment surgery. In another place, the judgment says, and I quote, a person's sex is usually assigned at birth, but a relatively small group of persons may be born with bodies which incorporate both or certain aspects of both male and female physiology. At times, genital anatomy problems may arise in certain persons. Their innate perception of themselves is not in conformity with the sex that is assigned to them at birth, and this may include pre- and post-operative transsexual persons. The judgment, however, is very clear about the need for cultural legibility to access social and political entitlements. It actually says, it becomes imperative to first assign them their proper sex in order to give social benefits. Thus, we see that the judicial system of the Brahmin Empire struggles to assign the proper sex to gender-variant people in order to make us more legible for administrative control. Trans-led political movements, in spite of a deep distrust for the state, for reasons that you can imagine, are caught in this paradox where we have to simply flatten and simplify our gender incongruity and experiences of social exclusion in order to demand equality under the frame of constitutional rights. Within the symbolic order of the nation-state, however, the pure morality of the cisgender heterosexual family, which functions within the limits of caste endogamy, is constructed in opposition to the immorality and pollutedness of the barren, sexually promiscuous hijra. Though there is a passing mention of trans men in the Supreme Court judgment, we find no mention of us in colonial records or ethnographies. The reasons for this could be many, including but not limited to the fact that trans women or hijras had religious sanction under Islam and Hinduism, although they were relegated to a degraded status. The hypervisibility and eroticization of their constructed difference and the resultant curiosity they evoked as objects of study from the colonial period to present-day academic practice, apart from the valiant struggle, of course, that they have led against a deeply violent society, heteropatriarchal society that is very casteist. In contrast to this, the endogamous caste control of we, who have been raised as girls and who have been assigned a female gender, the fact that we are not labeled as a high-risk group under neo-imperialist HIV funding, the impossibility of the marketability of our sexuality to the phallocentric consumerism of sex trade, has resulted in the near invisibilization of trans men and other gender-variant identities in public discourse. The rejection of endogamous reproductive function by trans people also means an abdication of the reproduction, literally and metaphorically, of caste relations and labor force, making us lesser citizens of the Brahmin Empire. Moreover, trans communities have a familial system in which sisterhood across caste is possible and often practiced. Of course, I'm not making the claim that there is no caste within trans communities. There is caste, and there are separate gharanas for Dalits trans women and separate gharanas for dominant caste trans women. However, the collective experience of being disowned by your what is called your natal families, and also the structural exclusions, which is a collective experience of employment and education, create the possibility of a strong sense of belonging and what Dr. Ambedkar would call consciousness of kind. The long-term biopolitical project of cultivating gender incongruence by eliminating incongruity has achieved a high degree of institutionalization over the past century and a half, including the development of professional organizations, medical standards of care for transgender individuals, a significant body of case law and public policy, peer-reviewed social scientific publications, and academically affiliated research centers and clinics. Even as biomedical interventions and projects of governmentality seek to classify and regulate gender bodies through confessional practices of psychiatry, which to this day remain prerequisites for gender-affirming surgeries in India, we offer disruptions to the existing gender binary model, resulting in what I would call a crisis in classificatory regimes through centuries that fail to contain our identities and expressions. Susan Stone argued that juxtaposing medically constituted transsexual embodiments against the backdrop of cultural intelligible gendered bodies generated new and unpredictable dissonances in which we may find the potential to map the refigured body onto conventional gender discourse and thereby disrupt it. This would compel the ways in which we understand gender to take advantage of the dissonances created by such a juxtaposition to fragment and reconstitute the elements of gender in new and unexpected geometries. The possibilities of exploring these new geometries of gender would compel us to examine gender as beyond a concept symbolically constructed through physically bordered limits and towards exploring gender as consciousness. This is why I changed the title of my paper to towards an alternative gender consciousness, because I think what I would suggest as a way to move beyond the biologically essentialist ways in which gender is understood is to move away from that and to think of gender as consciousness. A useful concept to explore in this field would be to see gender variant lived realities as double consciousness. And I borrow this concept from Du Bois, who's a black writer and historian, who says that the double consciousness basically means that we have our own unique experiences and perspectives of the world, and also we also have the experiences of how we are viewed by the outside world, which he calls the sense of looking at oneself through the eyes of others. So this really captures the trans experience because this sort of double consciousness is really what comes into play when I even think about the ways in which I interact with the world. For example, to give you just a small anecdote, there was this one time that I was coming back from work and it was kind of late, and I got off this bus, and we who are raised assigned a female gender have been taught to walk really fast, to not loiter around, to have a purposeful walking, right? So I have not been able to, even after transition, I still have that socialization. So I'm walking really fast, and then after a while I noticed that this woman who was in front of me, who was also walking really fast, started turning around and looking at me, right? And after a while I realized that she was perceiving me as a threat, right? And in my consciousness I was walking fast because I've been socialized to walk fast. So this kind of double consciousness, where the world is looking at you in a certain way and you are looking at yourself in a completely different way, is useful to understand the trans experience. And I think there is also Chicana queer feminist theorist and writer Gloria Anzaldúa, who in her book Borderland says that the work of mestiza consciousness, she brings another theory, which is the borderland consciousness, mestiza consciousness, is to break down the subject-object duality that keeps her a prisoner, and to show in the flesh and through the images of her work how duality is transcended. The answer to the problem between the white and the color, between males and females, lies in healing the split that originates in the very foundation of our lives, our culture, our languages, and our thoughts. And this is a quote from Borderland. So I think that this is what I would like to suggest as the way forward for how we think about gender, as mestiza consciousness or a double consciousness, and to move away from a biologically essentialist notion. It's interesting also because Dr. Ambedkar, who's also an anti-caste radical thinker, as well as the first Law Minister of India, he, in his writings on caste, has also talked about how caste is consciousness, how caste is not biology, how caste is not blood, it's not the mythical, idea, the Brahminical idea of the purity of the blood. It is not. So he also talks about caste as consciousness. And I think it would be useful to look at gender as well as consciousness. And I would like to conclude by saying that the hegemonic dualism and power relations of gender, race and caste can be challenged through the creation and exploration of such a borderland consciousness which resist and challenge violently imposed conceptual frameworks. Thank you.
Has very productively opened up the idea of gender so that we can not think of it not only in the more traditional ways of biologically essentialist, but I think he has also opened up the idea of gender for feminism.